I think every so often we need to step back from a conflict like the Ukraine conflict and consider the reality according to the more dispassionate sort of observations. And one of the best is to look at the concept of the just war. Now, I was teaching a philosophy class last night, and this came up, though not the specifics, and it made me think. The just war theory, starting with St. Augustine, refined by Thomas Aquinas, establishes a series of criteria for a war to be morally justified. And the invasion of Ukraine, I think, fails to meet these benchmarks. First of all, it needs to be declared and waged by a legitimate authority acting for the common good. Russia's invasion was not sanctioned by any international body like the United Nations or supported by global consensus. The action, therefore, is an act of unilateral aggression by a single state against a single sovereign nation. It's compounded by the fact that a good deal of deceit was involved in attempting to establish a legitimate act, a legitimate reason for going into Ukraine in the first place. We'll get to that. Was there a just cause? A war is only just if it redresses a grave or a certain wrong, such as self-defense or protecting innocents from imminent harm. Russia's stated reasons for the invasion were various, and they kept being stated. When one reason didn't work, they tried another. So a war, a crusade to restore Ukraine to orthodoxy, denazification, NATO expansion, protecting Russian speakers in Ukraine. All of these, the Russian speakers in Ukraine, is simply a repetition of the pretext for going into Georgia earlier. So Putin had already tried that one. The NATO expansion, actually there's no evidence of NATO expansion. The only NATO expansion that took place in response to Putin's invasion. Denazification, well, the Nazis in Ukraine were the Wagner paramilitaries with their Nazi insignia, with their Nazi behavior of smashing people they didn't like with crowbars. There was Nazi behavior in Ukraine, but it was Kremlin-inspired. And there's no credible evidence of actual harm or threats that warranted military invasion, so it fails on point 2. Point 3, right intention. The intention is to achieve peace and justice, not to pursue territorial expansion, economic gain, or vengeance. That's what Aquinas says. Well, Russia's actions appear motivated simply by territorial ambitions, including reclaiming influence over former Soviet land and undermining Ukraine's sovereignty rather than achieving or acting or trying to get a just peace. So it fails there. Proportionality. The harm caused by war must not exceed the harm being addressed, and the invasion has caused immense civilian suffering, widespread destruction of infrastructure, and a humanitarian crisis far outweighing any claimed justification for war. Now, I think it's very interesting, and I'm going to rely on my friend Colin Robertson here, who's done a very interesting analysis of the missile that was used in Dnipro, the Oreshnik missile strike. Just listen to what he's got to say here.
If you look at what the intercontinental ballistic missile that hit Dnipro actually is, has a landing spot radius of about 100 to 300 meters. That's about 3 football stadiums. So it's pretty inaccurate where it can land, and that's why there are residential buildings still on fire in the radius of where it's landing. That's why it hit buildings with innocent civilians, and that is why those missiles are never used until last night in populated areas. This is actual escalation, and everyone who has been talking about Ukraine escalating things in the last few days for putting strategic storm shadows and strategic ATACMS inside war zone battlefields, inside Kursk, targeting commanders and launch sites, which is absolutely ethical during a war, are silent about this. They're saying nothing about how Russia has basically committed a gigantic war crime in the last few hours. And even the Russians know this is unacceptable. In the last couple of hours, Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson literally embarrassed herself when she got a phone call, not thinking that the media were recording this, telling her not to comment on what happened in Dnipro, because even the Russians know it's fucking terrible.
Так, с нами ли портал News.ru? Да. Алло. Да, у меня брифинг.
Я боюсь массу удар баллистическими ракетами, о чем Запад не стали говорить, не комментирую вообще.
Да, хорошо, спасибо.
But that phone call, that's an admission of guilt. 100%. They know it's wrong and they know it's going to spark international outrage.
And today, there are reports of Russian casualties. We shouldn't underestimate the oppressive nature of Putin's regime and the meat grinder effect of so many young soldiers being thrown at the front line in Suja, in Severus, in Petrovsk. Even if small amounts of land are won back, the Russian casualty rate is enormous. And at the same time, the civilian suffering is enormous simply because of this war. It isn't proportional, and it's inflicted by the Kremlin. Yesterday in Kaluga, which is a city, it is one city on towards Moscow from the Kursk region, and it's a dull city, but it has a large oil depot. Most cities in Russia have a large oil depot. Why? Because Russia has this very strange idea of genuinely providing central heating. So your heating is provided by the state, by the city, and these great pipes go across the roads, carrying the fuel, and it goes into your tower block, and you have no say about when the heating starts, when the heating stops, and it is intense. How hot it is! It is intense. So what I found so peculiar when I first went to Moscow was I went in the middle of the winter, and it was freezing. I remember trying to sketch the iron bridge running across the river next to the Kremlin, and I did manage to do it, but my hands were practically dropping off by the end of it, and I had to finish the sketch when I got back home. But the the effect of this, the thing which struck me so odd, was going past all these tower blocks and seeing the windows wide open. And when I lived there on a permanent basis, and I lived right at the top of one of these blocks of flats, I was put there by the university, the only way to regulate the temperature was to open the window. So I understand. But yesterday, but at the moment, Ukraine aims to keep about 15% of oil production out of action in Russia. So Kaluga, like many cities, has got a significant oil depot, and it was hit yesterday. Ukraine is consciously targeting refineries and consciously stopping Russia using all its oil reserves. So the aim, I think, is to keep about 15-20% of Russia's oil out of action, and that will affect the amount of that will affect the capabilities of the war effort. It's a good action, and it also means you've got oil refinery smoke in the air and these sort of spectacular fires a consequence of Putin's actions. And this is about proportionality. The Ukrainian response is proportional. The Russian attack is completely out of proportion. So the intercontinental ballistic missile attack, or the hypersonic missile attack, whatever you want to call it, it's out of proportion. As Kalin says, the impact site, it's not designed to target one small area. It's designed to leave buildings on fire for days. Shouldn't be fired into a civilian area. It should be a last resort war, and war should only be undertaken when all peaceful alternatives such as diplomacy or negotiation have been exhausted. That didn't happen. There was no exhaustive diplomatic effort to resolve the issues, as the invasion was preemptive, sudden, violating this principle, and was simply an attempt to stop Zelensky from renegotiating the Minsk agreements, which he'd already said in his election manifesto he was proposing to do. He was elected to shut down the Minsk agreements. He was elected to shut down corruption. And then the probability of success. Aquinas says war should only be waged if there's a reasonable chance of success in achieving just outcomes. Russia's invasion has led to a prolonged conflict and resistance with no clear path to peace or resolution that would align with any just war principles. The Rome Statute, which underpins the International Criminal Court, criminalizes actions that constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of aggression, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine fails the legal tests. A. It's a crime of aggression. The statute defines aggression as the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state. Russia's invasion breaches Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity directly, violating Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and the Rome Statute. B. Putin is deeply involved in war crime. It includes targeting civilians, disproportionate attacks, and the use of banned weaponry, like hypersonic missiles, like gas. Documented atrocities such as the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, residential areas, as in Mariupol and Bucha, constitute war crimes. Fact. Crimes against humanity, widespread and systematic attacks on civilians as part of state policy. Fact. Russia's actions including mass deportations, the seizure of children, summary executions, widespread destruction, are systemic and deliberate. And finally, a lack of defensive necessity. The Rome Statute and the Just War Doctrine state that a state can invoke self-defense only when facing actual or imminent armed attack. So Russia's claim that it moved into Ukraine as an act of self-defense is poppycock. Russia faced no legitimate existential threat from Ukraine, making the claim of defensive necessity invalid under international law. And even now, when Russia is redefining its nuclear methodology about facing an existential threat from Ukraine, that is a threat that it has itself invoked. Ukraine is acting in self-defense. Putin doesn't have a leg to stand on. An international law. Now, I know he claims to have got some legal experience. He paid somebody to write a doctoral thesis, but that doesn't necessarily mean he understands it. The Ukrainian invasion violates Aquinas' principles of legitimate authority, just cause, right intention, proportionality, last resort, and the probability of success. It fails to meet Augustine's moral framework for justifiable war. It constitutes crimes of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. As a result, it can never be defended. There is nothing that can possibly explain the invasion of Ukraine as anything other than a perversion of justice and a perversion of peace. As for the Oreshnik missile, this is about technological superiority. It's about stealth, delivering a payload, or at least threatening that a payload could be delivered with this sort of missile. It's about machismo bragging and relaunching the arms race. It's an horrendous attack on a city that was not really in the front line, Dnipro. It's not really in the front line. It was chosen simply because it was there, and the environmental consequences of this, who knows? Who knows what that will be? But the historical comparisons will be made about this missile attack, and I think the deployment of cluster munitions, in the past, and I think it's pure chance that more people were not killed, that the civilian casualty rate seems to have been very low. Pure chance. And Ukraine has been very lucky from that point of view. But this is a vicious and utterly unacceptable move by a heinous and oppressive regime. And if you need if you need to know why we have to stand up to Putin, this is why. When you look at the just war theory, you say, well, if just one of those things were there, if there was just one reason why this war was defensible, then maybe we could understand, but there is not any. Now, more than that, Orthodoxy doesn't accept the just war theory, or at least the ecumenical patriarchate does not accept the just war theory. That means the ecumenical patriarch based in Istanbul, the Greek church, the Romanian church, and so on. And until 2000, the Russian church followed the same principles. But Kirill adopted the just war theory at the beginning of this century. So Russia has embraced, morally and politically, has embraced the just war theory, so must be measured on what it has claimed. And Kirill has egged on this intolerable regime. Kirill, this ex-KGB dissolute monk, has egged on his friend Putin in this act of defiance, this act of evil, this disregard for the very principles that the Russian patriarch, that the Moscow patriarch has embraced. So on every level,